Welcome to tonight's Michigan State University Beekeeping Office Hours webinar. Today is June 1st, 2026. I'm Anna Heck, and I'm here with Zachary Wong, Keith Mason, Megan Milbrath, and Dan Wines. This is a Michigan State University Extension program, and our programs and materials are open to everyone. For tonight's webinar, we will share some announcements. We'll have a bloom update from Zachary Wong, a weather update from Keith Mason, some beekeeping updates from MSU in terms of what we're doing and seeing in our colonies, and then we'll respond to your beekeeping questions. We post our webinar recordings to our MSU Extension site for beekeeping and pollinators. You can find them at canr.msu.edu/bees and click videos. We also post our webinar recordings to the Michigan State University Beekeeping YouTube channel. We have online articles that list resources for Michigan beekeepers based on the month, so you can find our list of resources for this month in June. It has resources that are based off of different topic areas that are relevant this month. We're excited about a conference that MSU Extension is hosting on Thursday, June 18th. It's called Healthy Habitats and Productive Pollinators. It's a all-day in-person conference in Flint, Michigan. Registration's open, and it really is focused on the ways to support bees and pollinators through habitat and on supporting the wild species of bees. I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate that we get funding for our programs and work from a few different sources, including the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, from USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and Project GREEEN. If you have questions outside of our webinars, we would love for you to ask them using our Ask Extension form, which you can find at pollinators.msu.edu/questions. And this is a great way for people in Michigan to send questions to MSU Extension about beekeeping and other extension topics.
Good evening, everyone. This is Zachary Huang. I have been at Michigan State University for almost 28 years. Today we're going to go through the flowers that are blooming near the East Lansing, Okemos area. So black locust, which is a large honey crop here in Michigan, it's largely down. And my wife and I drove around to see the blooming situation, and think about half of the trees did not bloom this year. Last year we saw so many trees, even just coming back from Detroit, nowhere coming back, you see trees along the roadsides, beautiful white flowers hanging down, more white than the leaves. Now the plant is autumn olive that has finished blooming. Bees love it too, and produces a darker honey, probably a bit spicy, invasive everywhere by the roadside along the highways. Still blooming, Chinese dogwood, which is of course a cornus, with big large white flowers. I've seen pictures of honeybees foraging on this flower. But last Saturday I went to the garden, MSU BO Botanic Garden. I did not see any insect visiting this plant. The other one, a small flower dogwood, is pagoda dogwood. I have seen honeybees on this plant, but this year I have not seen them yet. Southern arrowwood, Verbellen dentatum. I need to make my slide bigger. That was blooming and supposed to be very attractive to pollinators and honeybees. But in my brief encounter on Saturday, I did not see them. Allspice is also blooming. no bees. I was lucky to see honeybees foraging on American bittersweet, a small bush, many honeybees and bumblebees, and a rosaceae, a little bit larger tree, Stearns medlar, lots of honeybees, lots of solitary bees, and the bumblebees. So that's a good plant to plant those two plants. Japanese spiraea, a common garden crop. I have honeybee photos, but it's now largely done. Cotoneaster is a growing cover. Bees also love it. It blooms all summer, starting right now. White Dutch clover has been blooming on somebody's lawn, I saw, but it's only starting, and it should bloom all summer if it has enough rains. Red clover, I have some in my front yard, has been blooming. Another legume that grows very tall and beautiful with different colors, blue, yellow, white, pink. It's called Baptista. It has larger flowers, similar to lupine, that I do not see honeybees very often. I did see a lot of bumblebees and more carpenter bees yesterday. There's another small bush that's blooming in the family Rutaceae, same family as oranges and lemons. Wafer ash, and it looks like the flowers should attract the pollinators. I did not see any bees. Many types of irises are blooming now. There's tall and skinny German iris attract honeybees. There's another one that's mostly yellow, blooming around Mother's Day. I have pictures of honeybees foraging on them. Blue-eyed grass is another small flower in the family of iris. I did not see bees. It's in the MSU Botanical Garden, so I was expecting to see bees. So that's one thing that you could go and wait for bees for a whole week. You might be there at the wrong time, or maybe too many competitors, or you're just unlucky. But another time you could see tons of bees, and that have happened to me many times. One plant that's in a grape family, I saw so many bees, thousands of bees, and I used my cell phone to take pictures. I did not go back on the same day. Next day I went there, nothing. Same time, 6 p.m., no bees. So I learned my lesson. I have to bring my camera back the same day or I'm going to miss it. Peonies are very picky now. Honeybees came to our tree peony flowers and also the peony that's blooming now. Tree peony, there are two types of peonies. Tree peonies are the ones with stems, tree branches surviving through the winter, and peonies are more annual. The top plant is annual, but the roots will survive through the winter and produce new shoots every year. Flower-wise, it's very hard to distinguish the two types of plants. Other minor plants, penstemons, water lily, potentilla, thyme, salvia, valerian, Vagella, even asparagus are blooming now as honeybees and bumblebees. Columbines blooming. I have seen honeybees foraging on this plant in North Carolina, but not in Michigan. And a plant that's coming up, a big nectar plant, is basswood, also called linden. Latin name is Tilia. We should have 5 or 6 different species here in Michigan. Again, you can smell them when they bloom. They have some in Okemos parking lot and Meyer parking lot. Should bloom in 2 or 3 weeks. I hope. And the honey they produce has very light color and very fragrant flavor, and you taste the mintiness near the end of the uh, session. So it's like aftertaste. Whereas black locust is even lighter, like water white, but you taste the vanilla with black locust. So those are the main Michigan honey plants: black locust, basswood, and then white clover. And the sweet clovers also that should be coming up soon. I have not seen them. And tulip poplar might be starting to bloom in 1 or 2 weeks. That's all for today. Thank you for the bloom. I tried to blog them on my bees.msu.edu website.
I'm Keith. I'm the Enviro Weather Coordinator. I'm not the AV guy anymore. All right, let me figure out where to drive here. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on with the weather. And I'll start here first with let me clear this. With the temperatures that we've had, and generally we've been in a cool spell, and we're looking at just the last week here, and our average temperatures were only in the 50s and 60s. I mean, that's an average between highs and lows, but pretty much across the state we were in the 50s and 60s as an average. Um, and that we see on the left hand side there, a lot of the same color. On the right is the temperatures, um, with respect to normal. So how much are they different than we normally have? And you can see that there's in the browns are where things were generally warmer than they were for normal. So on the west side of the state, and actually the northern part of the state, were normal than they normally are at this time of year. But the central and eastern parts of Michigan were either kind of on the normal side where they should be, or maybe just a little bit behind. Um, so uh, that's kind of the look, for the last week. And if we take a look at the last month, we've got basically more of the same. So overall it was much cooler, um, and we were in the 40s and 50s as average temperatures. It is a little, there's more data from earlier in the season where temperatures are a little cooler, so we'd expect that. But again, on the right hand side here is where we're looking at, the temperatures we've had in comparison to what we've seen over the last 30 years. And overall, May was 2 to 4 degrees cooler overall than we normally see. So, we've been up and down a lot, and this was another piece of that here, this year. And we measure this with growing degree days, or at least we can keep tabs on it. So it's really a way of summing up heat units over time, and it kind of tracks the development of plants and insects. So we can use these units to predict when things happen. Um, and we've obviously added more as you go through the season, things warm up, and we've added about 300 growing degree days in the south. So we're up around 650 now. And up north, it doubled as well, to about now there are 200 growing degree days. So, generally you expect the northern to warm up a little slower. But actually, with the slowdown that we saw in May, we're less far ahead in the south than we were when we talked a month ago. A month ago, we saw on the right hand side, we saw a bunch of, or much darker red in this area, and it was more blue towards the north. indicating that they were behind in the north and ahead in the south, and things have kind of evened up a little bit now. So the south is only about 7 days ahead or so, and 2 to 3 days behind in the north, whereas it was at least a week behind in the north and like 2 weeks ahead in the south. So things are evening up a little bit here when we look at our growing degree days here. Okay, now turning over to rainfall. Here is, I mean, it's not a surprise that we're really dry. We've known we've seen a lot of really nice weather actually. It's a shame that yeah, we need some water. But yeah, most areas were under half an inch just from last week. And that we see on the left-hand side just as the totals, and on the right is in comparison to that 30-year normal kind of average rainfall. And when we look at the right-hand side, we can see that we in just the last week we're like a quarter to a half or to a full inch behind where we were normally in May. Is usually one of our wetter months. So over the and this pattern, I guess, started earlier in the month too, where we did have up to 3 inches in some areas of Michigan for the month of May. But general, when we add it all together and how much we actually should have, we're still below normal. So we're like an inch to 3 inches below, pretty much statewide. There's a little bit of excess in the Northeast, but other than that, things are getting dry, and we're seeing that in the topsoils. The soils at depth, though, there's more moisture down there. Um, that's, that helps for deep-rooted plants. So a lot of, trees generally will, they can stay the course, but, plants that are using the top part of the soil, they're going to have more of a problem, with getting enough water. So I added this right at the last bit here. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor, where it looks at different measurements of what how moist the soils are. It uses some satellite imagery and then a bunch of sensors that are in the ground, and EnviroWeather's data goes into this. But even with the low rainfall and the drying of the soils, we don't have any defined drought in Michigan yet, which is good, so it makes it easier to rebound if we can get some rainfall, basically. Um, I don't think that's going to happen very soon, but we're hoping to see a few changes that way too. Although the short range that I'll show you here doesn't have that coming up for us yet. Okay, so this is a little bit of meteorology here, but it's why we are so dry essentially, for the most part. We're under a very high pressure, an area of high pressure that's come down from Canada. It's also very dry air, so that's not helping our soils at all. But it's in normally during the summer, these lines are really track the movement of the jet stream in the northern hemisphere, and that really determines a lot about how storms are carried across the continent, and how we see different trends when there are these different shapes of the jet stream. And the one that we see now is fairly rare, but it's called an omega block. And what it's doing is it's blocking the normal flow from west to east, which is normally how systems come across the continent. so we can, usually see rainfall moving through and front starting and identify where the rainfall is. This is kind of blocking that flow and also blocking the moisture that would come up from the Gulf of Mexico. Um, so those are kind of why they're called blocking factors, but it's a feature that makes it really difficult to forecast what's going to happen, and it's they say that it makes liars out of meteorologists because they think it's going to move off, and I'm going to tell you it's going to move off in just a little bit. But even it does look like it's persisting for a bit. So remember, we've got this big kind of hump here in the middle, where kind of the air that's coming through moves in that pattern, which isn't normally what we've got. This high ridge over the Midwest typically means dry. So that's just a big feature that is very consistent. Um, and so now this is a rainfall forecast graph through, well, actually for June 3rd, but it doesn't change between now and June 3rd. We just have high pressure over the area, which there's not moisture to generate any kind of rainfall, and there's not, big systems moving across where there's moisture. But it looks like there may be a visitation here, possibly um, towards the middle of the week, maybe the end of the week, if it makes it through this block. And whether that's going to happen, it looks a little unlikely. Um, because I guess here's another look at it is that they're projecting to have low rainfall in the area. All the greens here are around a half an inch and below, so we think we're in for at least another dry week. Um, when we go out a little bit farther, if you look at this map of the jet stream here, it's flattening out a little bit. We still have a bit of a ridge over Michigan, but this is a sign, or at least it's a sign for meteorologists that um, it should lessen. So we should switch back to this normal flow. Um, and what they're predicting then is that we're going to see warmer temperatures. So we will have an increase in temperatures, and that's what we typically see with a zonal flow too, that straight flow across. And so there's a little possibility of some rainfall in the southern parts of Michigan here, based on the 6 to 10 day predictions that meteorologists have come up with. If we look out a little bit farther, we have the lines are flattening out a bit more. So that's hopefully a good sign for more flow across. Except well, I guess it looks like our rainfall actually is appearing or coming back to what we should see normally. And this is for the 8 to 14 day time frame here. So maybe after a week, we might see a little bit more tendency for rainfall here, but very strong signal for warmer than normal. So we're going to expect that here. And then I wanted to show we have some forecasts that are a little farther out. It's more coarsely grained, obviously, but it does show us at least what we think we're going to have. And looking through June, overall, it looks like it'll be warmer than normal. And because of um, I guess because of the dry period we're having in the first part of June, will likely be still below the average that we normally would get. So we're not sure whether we're getting very much help on recharging soils here in June. Um, and then we're getting no help from the 3 month outlook here. It's just too variable to tell really what's going to happen here. There is El Nino coming in later in the summer. We can talk about that probably next time when we can see some changes a little bit more and what that's going to mean um, for the latter half of the year and our fall and winter for sure. But basically here, these two white areas are showing that it's a toss up. Basically, we have equal chances of being hotter than normal or cooler than normal, and same thing for precipitation. It's equal chances of being above and below. So that doesn't help so much. But just kind of wrapping it up real quick, definitely cooler and drier. May overall, we saw that, and it looks like it's continuing because of that omega block that is has a huge ridge over the top of the Midwest right now. I didn't mention this, but along with this ridge, we're going to expect steady surface winds for the next week to 10 days as well. So that's kind of part of this high pressure system we've got. And we're still about 7 days ahead. If you kind of look at most of Michigan, some areas are a little bit behind. We definitely get a strong signal for being warmer than normal for the next month and the summer, or at least through June, and kind of leaning towards a lower rainfall and drier situation. Yep, seasonal outlook, we can't tell yet. And then yeah, these are just some links for other pieces that we have here. Yeah, and I did so I'll make sure that you guys have access to the slides here, but these are some of the references to the material that I just went over there. So I'm wondering if there are any weather questions. Um,
There are a couple. Um,
okay.
so one of them is, and I think they're both basically for you and Zachary together as teammates on this. So one of them says, how can we expect the mega El Nino going that will impact the timing and volume of the nectar flow through the fall?
Well, that's from my perspective. I'll start here. So the fall, I think we're going to be. It would be well El Nino. You know what? I'm not a meteorologist. I'm going to look that up for next time. But yes, the Midwest shouldn't be as largely impacted as other areas of the world. So it means big things for fruit crops and for row crops and other areas. Um, but yeah, the nectar flow, that's a really good question. And I'd like to hear what Zachary would say there too, just from his experience.
I assume El Nino is going to make it warmer than usual.
I mean, that's generally, yeah, what happens. And yeah,
Uh,
with a strong El Nino, or the predictability, I think it's they're predicting or their strong um, probability that we'll
uh,
have an El Nino. And I
uh,
guess it is, yeah, I guess it's not just that, but it is a really large, it would be the biggest one. But if I mean, I remember listening to Jeff talk about this and that um, in La Nina, we have, which is what we're coming out of, we have a warmer winter, a warmer, moister winter. So it's usually more mild.
uh,
Um, but the fall is really what we need to find out about, and it's kind of a transition period into the El Nino. So I'm not sure we'll see the full effects as things go through. And I think the El Nino would be towards it might be warmer and drier, might be
uh,
your tendency there. But that's definitely something that, yeah, I think I'll look forward to, or I'll do a couple of slides on El Nino for next time. That we'll know a little bit more for that. But that's a great question. And you
Yeah,
stop.
And then
I
there is a
yeah,
question. Oh, did you have
I,
more to
Mhm.
add, Zachary?
yeah, I would say it's more the drought probably affecting the plants more. But the temperature also, of course, if it's always 95, 100, that's plants probably shut down too. I think honeybees are, I would like to think honeybees are physiologically more like humans. So even though their brood nest is 95, they're actually outside temperature. Like my body temperature is 95, but I feel great at 74. So honeybees are very similar. Like once it's more than 85, they start fanning their hive. I think it's too hot when it's over 80, especially with high humidity. So, but for plants, actually, 85 is good for a lot of plants for nectar production. But as soon as you hit 90 or 95, most plants don't like it either. So there's this magical range between 80, I'll say between 80 to 85, possibly for both bees and plants are happy. But of course, if you have it dropped for too long, that's not good for the plant. Like clover, the ubiquitous white Dutch clover here in Michigan, if you have good moisture, it's going to bloom all summer long. Good honey production. But once you're dry for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they will basically wither and die off until the rain comes back. It's going to come back again. But
Mhm. Right.
3 weeks no rain, they will just become dried. So so it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
combination of moisture, precipitation, and the moderate temperature. So if we have a 95-degree for months, that's probably going to be very bad for the bees and for the plants also. So,
hmm
but
Yeah, because I
usually
guess
in
most of
Michigan, yeah,
them,
yeah,
yeah, most of the blooms then would not be trees. It's going to be,
yeah,
herbs and broadleafs and stuff, right? So yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
So yeah, the soil's going to tell the story, I think, and hopefully we'll see more rain. A lot of them are native plants and they're used to this, so hopefully
Mhm.
we'll see some survivors out there. But
yeah.
I saw there was also a question about the degree days when black locust bloomed, and my interest in that comes from the entomology side because great berry moth is the insect I studied for my PhD, and it's tied to wild grape bloom, which blooms basically at the same time of black locust,
Yeah.
which I think we estimated it at 350 growing degree days, base 50 from March 1st. March 1st, yes, for wild grape bloom. Um, and so part of this project that I'm working with this group on is to make a growing degree day calendar for these types of plants. And so, black locust is certainly one that, comes to mind for me because you can see it from the roadway, right? And that's what we were thinking is, hey, a grower's going to see that, they're going to go look for some wild grape now. So yes, I would say it's around 350, but we really need to do nobody, I don't think anybody's really looked and or looked through data or maybe that extension agents have, which is part of the project as well too, is we'll look through any historical data that we've got to try and pinpoint these growing degree day marks for the big blooms. So that's
And
a perfect question for this group. Yeah.
yeah, and just so everyone is aware, the project that Keith is referring to is this grant that we have that brings him here so he can do these weather reports. But a big part of it is so that we actually have predictive models for some of the main honey flows in Michigan too, so we can be just like the other crop people and get some more information. So some compliments for you, Keith, but that seems to be all of the questions we have related to weather. So thanks so much. I personally love having you come in and give
It's
these.
fun for me. It's actually good because, well, this time it was like, oh, I think I know what I'm saying.
Well,
Okay,
you
yeah.
fooled me last time too.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I'm going to go ahead and sign out that here, but yeah, have a great rest of the meeting. I'll talk to you later.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
All right, so I'll start going through the rest of the questions, and there's some good ones already, and obviously feel free to add more. I'm thrilled to see some beginner and like absolute beginner ones, so welcome to those of you. Dan, are you ready for a mean queen one? So there's a question, and it says, do you have any methods to calm an aggressive hive short of requeening? I get stung 3 to 4 times just opening the hive and have been stung just by walking by the hive at a distance of 30 feet or so. Thank you.
So my initial in reading that, I'm leaning towards requeening. If they're defending that big of a perimeter, like if they're defending 30 feet away and you're not even, opening the hive, there's a couple things that I would want to rule out before I said, this is probably genetic. Um, in bees that are stressed generally tend to be ornery, whether disease, parasite, pest, they're just, like when we're stressed, we're ornery. So if there's mite pressure or something going on in the colony, um, it's pretty early in the year for dearthy conditions. I think, summer bees can be mean. We get into, late July, August, bees are, get more robby, they get more assertive. Typically don't associate that with May and June, in most parts of Michigan. So I would want to rule out, colony stressors in like the disease, parasite, pest, health realm. And in the, um, aspect of pest, that's not something we think of because it's not in hive. I guess it's kind of technically a predator, but colonies that are getting harassed by skunks or other things at nighttime, they can be pretty ornery. And the best way to uh, identify skunks is you will usually see matted grass and after enough time kind of a little hollow dugout in front of the colony. Um, Skunks are nocturnal. They come in at night. They basically scratch at the entrance of the hive. The bees come out and they eat them one by one as the bees are coming out to investigate and defend. So if you see a lot of kind of matting down in front of the hive and that, it could be something like that. But um, generally, like as you described, if they're defending that big of an area, they're not just getting wound up when you're inspecting. Um, I would probably be looking towards recleaning.
I would agree. All right. Anna, uh, well, actually, I'm gonna have you do this next one. So, a pesticide question. So, someone says my neighbor has their yard sprayed with chemicals frequently through the summer. Their yard is close to my apiary. Is it a good idea to put a damp sheet over my hives while their yard is being sprayed? If not, what else can I do?
That's a good question. And we don't, it would be helpful if you had a little bit more information. So if you knew what they're spraying, where they're spraying, how they're spraying, and then also, so product and what they're applying it for. So when we're thinking about the risk to bees from a pesticide, we're thinking about the toxicity of that pesticide to the bees. And then we're also thinking about whether or not the bees are exposed to it. So, sure.
So Anna was with me at the Heartland Apicultural Society where we taught like 6 classes each the last 2 days. So you have to be patient with our voices.
Thanks. So I have a resource that I'll put in the chat so that has some ways that you can kind of start thinking about those questions. And again, if you have a little bit of an idea of what they're spraying and, if they're just spraying a lawn and there's not flowers in bloom, then we don't expect a lot of exposure to bees because the bees are not normally just, honeybees are not normally just like visiting grasses. But if they're applying pesticides onto something in bloom that bees are visiting, then we'd be a lot more concerned. And then it also depends again on what kind of product. So I'll put an article into the chat and into the webinar information, and it has a tool where you can look up different pesticides and their known toxicity to bees. Most of the time when I'm teaching pesticide applicators, we're asking them to use products that are less toxic to bees, that have a shorter residual time, so they're toxic for less time, but also just to avoid exposure as much as we can to bees, because even though we have some information on toxicity to bees, there can be a lot of unknowns. So if you are in a position where you do find that it is something toxic to bees, especially if it's an insecticide. Lots of those can affect bees. Some fungicides can as well. And if it seems like your bees might become exposed to them, you can put a damp sheet over your hive to try to keep the bees inside of the hive from foraging. Or you could put screens on the hive entrances. It also depends on, how long is that pesticide active for. So just doing it while they're applying it might not be for long enough.
Thanks. And so the question that I skipped over made me realize we didn't really talk about what we're doing in our hives right now. And so I think maybe I'll start with Dan, and then so the question is a nice one. It says, I started formic acid recently using the pads. Am I early, late, or on time? So maybe if you want to answer that and then kind of say it with what you've been doing with your bees and the MSU bees.
Yeah. So formic, early, later, on time, could be any one of those. But I will say just and again, not knowing, do you have overwintered colonies? Do you have new units? You installed a nuke or a package 4 or 5 weeks ago, just where exactly they're at. But and in general with mite management, better to be a little early than a little late. So if you're going to err on one side or the other, um, you can always, might wash, see where you're at. But it sounds like this question they've maybe put it on. I started formic recently. I think that's in like I put a treatment on, not like I'm a new user of formic for years to come. Um, so I did treat a lot of our colonies. It was Monday, Memorial Day. We had cold weather, cold Saturday, Sunday were wet, cold. Monday was good. So I treated a lot of colonies on Monday, a week today. Like the weather forecast with formic acid, I'm always very closely watching the weather. I like, that those first couple of 3 days really. Temperatures not exceeding, the label says not exceeding 85. Um, I like to, high 70s to low 80s is kind of what I feel like is optimal for that treatment. And I don't want to put it on colonies that are too small. If they're springs, so a lot of treatment on the overwintered colonies that I've trimmed them back. I've taken some splits out of them for swarm management, but they're still very big, robust, mature colonies, multiple supers on top of them. They're big animals at this point in the year. Some of the smaller, like the splits that were made a month ago, I would say 4 to 5 weeks ago, basically May 1st, give or take a few days either way. Those are just kind of filling out second boxes. They're kind of reaching maturity. They didn't get much of a brood break because I did make them with mated queens. Um, so the queen was confined for a few days, but there was really only a couple days of gap in laying. So there wasn't like a real true brood break split. But because they're smaller units, and actually a lot of them, we did some sampling this weekend as part of the conference. Megan mentioned we did a lot of mite washes for demonstration purposes, and they were showing very clean. So that was some of my information gathering this weekend and started this week was, do I want to get a treatment on this week? Um, our forecast in the general Lansing area is to get fairly warm, progressively warmer here after tomorrow's 70-ish, but we're going to get back to the mid and upper 80s by the end of the week and into the weekend. So given I've seen a lot of mite washes of zeros and ones, and I've got, mid to high 80 temperatures coming soon. A lot of those I will look at, revisit looking for a treatment window as we get into, 10 days down the road or so. We'll keep an eye on that extended forecast and looking for that treatment window in mid-June.
And for my bees, I also treated this last week with Formic Pro. A big part of that for me. So for the big overwinter ones that are queen right, I have a lot that are split and are requeening with queen cells. And so those are going to get, I put Baroxane in those so that they get the break in the brood cycle plus an OA treatment. So that's kind of what's taking care of them. And my reasonings for doing it this early were the same as Dan of watching the weather coming up. Also for me, I just needed to get them in so I didn't have to worry about them knowing we'd have a beautiful weekend that I wouldn't be able to take care of my bees. I had to make sure that they were all kind of taken care of during the conference. So the lifetiming part of it too. Anna, there is a follow-up for how long to keep the screens on if you were going to screen in your bees. And they say they live next to two different farms that are near the yard. Not sure what they're applying most of the time.
So the answer is we don't know because it depends on what they're applying and what the residual toxicity time is. And some of the pesticide labels will say that, and some of them won't necessarily. So we don't really know. I think if it were like for me as a beekeeper, or a one-time event where I knew my neighbors were applying something like an insecticide that was toxic to bees, I would probably screen them for the full day and just put it on, at night, the night before, or early in the morning, and keep them on all day. I think if you're in a situation where you're seeing a lot of pesticides applied on farms nearby frequently throughout the season, that's pretty common. We have a lot of colonies in or near ag land, and a lot of our colonies do really well there. We do occasionally have acute pesticide kills where we lose colonies all at once, but from pesticides, that's not super common. We know that there's a lot of chronic or sublethal effects on bees just being exposed to pesticides throughout the season. However, we also know that we can keep bees healthy or healthy enough and alive in lots of agricultural settings as well. So if it's a frequent occurrence, personally as a beekeeper, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're constantly screening your bees, you're going to deprive them of nutrition. If it's hot out, they're going to need to forage for water. So I'd also worry about that.
And a lot of my bees are right on the edges of fields, and it's pretty hard to go anywhere in Michigan where they're not going to be within flight distance. And one thing that comforts me when I see stuff being sprayed is that there's probably lots of sprays that I'm not seeing, and my bees are doing just fine. So it's even worse than I think it is, and they're still okay. You do have to keep in mind that your bees are going to be covering like 15 to 20,000 acres. And, like obviously the ones really close are, really close, but there's a lot and the bees are able to handle quite a bit and they do really well in Michigan in most cases, even though many, many, many hives are close to ag land. Dan, for the follow-up, are you doing one or two pads of Formic Pro? And they ask for how long, but maybe we could reword that for how many applications too.
Yeah, so almost exclusively two pads at the same time. Couple reasons for that. One, just labor efficiency. I use Formic as a treatment when I have supers on, and it's got to go down. Either if it's a single, it's going to go right on top of that single, or if it's a double, it's going to go between the brood boxes. So I'm lifting a lot of boxes just to apply. I don't want to do that twice in 10 days. So I put the two pads on again I am watching the temperature. Um, and the other aspect of that is if I put the reason of two versus one in my mind, that's the primary, but I can put a pad on today and, I appreciate all the information Keith has at his disposal, but he also would tell you, when you're looking at 10-day forecast, it's an estimation, and I don't want to be in a situation where I need to apply this 10 days down the road. And when I looked 10 days out, it said it was going to be 78, and when I get to that time, it's 95. So I like just taking care of it. I've had good results with that, and it seems to be efficient. The only real situations where I've used it one and then a repeated one application, one pad and then one pad 10 days later is when I've got smaller colonies. Sometimes for research purposes, we're intentionally running smaller units. If I've got something that's maybe just in kind of two deeps without a bunch of supers, um, and I'm a little worried that two pads is going to be a little much for it, I'll go one and one in that. But that's fairly rare. Generally, then I'm looking for a different treatment option aside from formic acid, if that's the case. And I have been doing Formic Pro applications um, two and often three times per season. Usually I'm looking for that June 1st, give or take a week, looking at the weather and the condition of the bees, but usually right around the 1st of June. And then I'm usually looking for a mid-July, mid-late July, and then kind of an end of August, early September. And then, after that, it's post-harvest and kind of evaluate where I'm at. But that's been pretty common. As far as a treatment regimen, last year we started just initially with Viroxan being on the market, looking at maybe replacing one of those summer treatments of Formic with Viroxan, so something that covers that long time span through the summer. And again, I've put it in once, and you've got is it a 6 week duration? What's is it? Forget the exact number of days, but it's a long duration treatment. So looking at maybe two formics and a Viroxan instead of three formics. So kind of trialing that out. So that's kind of been the approach.
56-day max.
56. Okay.
Yeah.
So 8 weeks.
Yeah. So Zachary, I have a question for you, and it says the bees seem to be packing tons of pollen into the supers. Will they consume it, or will the bees move pollen from the supers?
So it's actually several questions. The easier one to answer is no, bees do not move pollen because it's sticky and they basically only eat it when they need them for feeding, usually related to feeding brood. But occasionally colonies will have too much pollen bound that takes space from honey production or brood, queen laying eggs if it's in a brood box. Usually they're in a brood box. So if you have like more than 3 or 4 frames solid pollen, I would say you have probably too many. Some people freeze them, keep them under -20 and use it next year, or give it to another colony that doesn't seem to have as much pollen. It'd be great if you're starting new package bees, especially if you install them early in Michigan, like middle April, and the pollen would help them a lot. So basically, your choices are limited. Either store them or give them to a colony that's still trying to build up. The weaker colony usually have less foragers for pollen collection. So they might help them. But bees usually do not move pollen, so that's the thing. And they do get in the way for the queen laying eggs in the brood box. So what you can do as a beekeeper is to even them into different colonies or freeze them.
All right, Anna, new beekeeper question. I started with a package mid-April and a nuke a week ago, and they are still consuming a gallon of 1-to-1 sugar water each per week. Is that normal? How long should I keep feeding them?
So that's great. We want to be feeding our packages and nuke sugar syrup because they're small colonies that maybe don't have the the workforce to go out and get food. And because in a lot of these cases, if you're new, you're hiving them on foundation and they need to be able to have sugar syrup or nectar in order to produce beeswax and build that comb out. So normally with those newer colonies, I would keep feeding them as long as they're still taking it until you put honey supers on.
And it will end soon. It should. There's a follow-up for you, Zachary. Can you explain the difference between pollen and bee bread?
If you have pollen inside the colonies, bee bread. So when we talk about pollen frames in the colonies, so bee bread is basically processed pollen that go through lactic acid fermentation. That's actually partial digestion or processing by the bees. It makes the pollen more nutritious. So if you see a pollen, the only time you would see actual unloaded pollen is two pellets still sitting there. So that when the pollen forages return to the colony, she would kick the pollen pellet into a cell, and she would then go out to do again foraging. Another bee has to use her head to hammer those paste into a paste, and that paste would take a few days to become pollen bread. And that's another thing I forgot. In Europe and in China now, there are people having special machines to harvest those pollen, the bee bread pellets. They freeze them, and they just when they freeze in the right temperature, the wax is so brittle, and I could just powder them, and the pollen still intact. So you have pollen tubes coming out, solid tubes, and then the cell is for human consumption. But again, Americans are usually more suspicious of stuff like that. But in Europe, they're doing that, eating them. And in China, of course, they have been selling bee-connected pollen for probably last 50 years. So you can buy lotus pollen, tea pollen, canola pollen. It's all usually sometimes mixed pollen, and people will eat them mixed with honey. So it's supposed to be a nutritious supplement.
I did see that machine at Apimondia this last year. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So maybe that's what you could invest if you have too many of those frames.
Turn it into money. Okay, so I'm going to answer the next one because this is one of my favorite topics for this time of year. And it said, I checked my hives today and one hive did not have any cat brood or eggs. What happened? And I'm going to put a link in the chat to an article I wrote on this. So I sell queens occasionally, not so much this year. So this is not an advertisement. Please don't call this week because I'm too tired. But at this time of year, I just get boatloads of requests for queens. And when I used to do consulting, I was like, I can't believe all these people need these emergency queens in June, and trying to figure out what's going on. And I started actually delivering the queens so I could see what was going on in people's hives when they called. And it prompted me to write an article that's called Help, I Need a Queen. And then the subcontext is actually, you probably don't. And so this time of year, it is very, 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 very common, and I would actually say expected and natural, that your old queens are going to get superseded. So if you're not replacing your queens religiously in the late summer, or you're not putting in young queens in the spring, and then you have old queens and they make it through swarm season, this is right when they get superseded, which means that they get killed off and then a new queen is in there. And there is going to be that period in there where you have a virgin that's going out or that's getting made that you just are not going to see anything. So my recommendation is just to close up the hive and wait 2 weeks, because it's either fine or it's not, or you can wait 1 week and you'll probably see, you'll either see eggs and brood, or you'll see lane worker indicating that it didn't work, in which case you would combine it with another colony. There are a couple other scenarios in which you wouldn't see brood or eggs that happen. One of them is starvation. And I did see that already this spring when we were in that really, really cold, where the bees will just actually eat through, but that's pretty obvious to tell because there's also no food in the hive. Then the other situation is the exact opposite, where things are starting to get nectar bound, and meaning that the bees bring in so much nectar that there's no room for the queen to lay eggs. And in that case, you just need to add a lot more space. All right, Dan, unless anyone has anything to add, I'm going to give you the most difficult question just so we can all watch you struggle. So it says, I'm a first-time beekeeper with 2 hives. One is going strong. I started to see cat brood in my inspection 2 weeks back and a rather spotty pattern in one of the hives. When I inspected over the weekend, the newer capping is looking even more spotty. There's only some density near the edges and a few single caps scattered over the frame. Is it better to wait to see if things resolve themselves, or should I try to requeen quickly? And maybe you can also just add in what more information you would need to answer
Yeah,
this.
yep. So I'm trying to visualize here. So one's going good. One was good-ish 2 weeks ago. Capped brood. 2 weeks back, rather spotty pattern in one of the hives. So it sounds like the quality of the brood is getting worse. It was maybe okay. I guess so. I'm guessing as a first-time beekeeper, we're not in the overwintered scenario. So it's not like Megan just talked through like, okay, you had an overwintered queen, you know, superseding, although, you know, queens do supersede, new queens can. Um, but it does sound like this is why we encourage beekeepers to have 2 colonies, even kind of compare and contrast. And so if you didn't have the strong, healthy one, you might not realize that the weaker one was struggling. You kind of don't know what, you know, normal or good looks like. Um, so generally beehives that are declining this time of year,
Mhm.
um, or I guess I would say a queen, if your pattern's getting worse this time of year, it's either going to supersede or you can intervene, I guess. It's not going to get better. If she's struggling in June with food and resources available, the bees are either going to requeen themselves through a supersedure or, you know, you can intervene. I saw Anna raise your hand. You have a
Yeah, so a lot of times when I'm talking with new beekeepers about brood, my suggestion is to just try to identify the difference between what looks healthy and what looks sick. I'm really curious. You're talking about a spotty brood pattern, and so that could be because some of the brood aren't surviving or because they're sick. And so I'd really look closely at those open brood cells to see if they look healthy. And I think this is probably where Dan was going. Um, and as a new beekeeper, it can be really hard to diagnose brood diseases. We have a few resources. I'm going to put a link in the chat to a tool that we made for veterinarians, and it has a lot of photos. And then also, if you send us photos to Emma, if you're in Michigan and you send us photos through the Ask Extension form, we can also look at your photos and see if we can figure out if it's a bacterial brood disease, if that's the cause of the spotty brood pattern.
And yeah, and it's sending photos through the portal is always awesome. Because there's a lot that it's just kind of, especially when you're new, you don't maybe necessarily know what exactly to look for and what to word. And so that is definitely the easiest for us. So does anyone on this call use green drone removal frames? Zachary does, and he heats them up and electrocutes the mites inside. So Zachary developed the mite zapper, um, which was based on the drone removal frames. I don't use the plastic ones, but part of that for me is I don't use um, plastic frames in general. There are some times that I use drone removal, but what I'll do in that context is put a medium frame in a deep box and just let them draw a drone across the bottom. I will tell you that my use of drone removal for mite control is usually related to when I have chickens, and then I can feed the drones to the chickens because that's where I get most of the pleasure from the entire experience. So I do intermittent drone brood removal, but a lot of times I tend to leave the drone brood because I'm also raising queens. simultaneously. Anna, I have one that I know you're ready for. Thoughts on using Viraxan laying? I think you were here for this conversation. Using Viraxan laying top of the frames versus folding them over as directed.
Yeah, so the Roxanne label explains to hang the strip over the frames, and that's because it's been tested that way, and that's how it's been shown to be effective. And so the way that Roxanne works is you want it to come into contact with the bees and especially the mites. And if you just put it on the top bars, you're not going to have it as much contact on those mites. It's going to be less effective, and it's also not consistent with how the product is supposed to be used. But I know that's something it's a common question we've been hearing from beekeepers, but a lot of these pesticide companies, they know that beekeepers would like an easier way to apply these treatments. So normally if it's a little bit harder to do, there's a good reason, like it's more effective, or there's some other reason why it's important to do it that way.
And for those types of questions too, like the reason we know the answer is because we've been told the answer by the company quite severely. Because you're not the first person to say that. And I know there's people on the internet purporting that, but and always you can always call the company and they can kind of give you a sense of, why the language is what it is too. So I think we're over an hour a bit, but there's one last question in the chat, and it says, when do you start raising queens in Michigan? And I generally start, so this year I was no, I guess I generally start the first week of May. And then that is usually though to get my starter going, to clean out my grafting room, to like find all my stuff, to make sure I have enough cups ordered. And and then that's usually what I use for my own splits, but I don't usually have enough to sell because, your starter's kind of small early. And then for me, where I am in Jackson County, it is really like midway, and I'll go mid-May, and I'll go all the way up kind of through July. And I've gone through August a little bit, but I tend to slow down near the end. But I definitely have a much stronger preference for the weather that Keith said, which is basically perfect mating weather for here on out for the queens. That's all the questions that we have, which is fantastic because I know we're all exhausted from the conference. So, but really good questions, and also really great to see so many new people too. And we look forward to talking to you next month and answering questions online for you.